After 20 years of roaring down highways with his Hells Angels brothers, Marcus Iron Sullivan thought he knew everything about his past. The leather jacket, the scarred knuckles, the reputation that made grown men step aside. This was his identity. But when he finally returns to the remote Montana cabin where he spent his childhood, expecting only cobwebs and painful memories, he discovers something that shatters everything he believed about himself. Hidden beneath loose floorboards are dozens of letters addressed to him, photographs of people he doesn't recognize, and documents that reveal a family secret so profound it changes the meaning of his entire life. His father wasn't the deadbeat drunk he remembered. His mother didn't abandon him by choice, and the reason he was truly alone all these years isn't what he thought. What family secret could be powerful enough to rewrite a Hells Angels understanding of his own story? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Harley's engine rumbled beneath Marcus like a caged beast as he carved through the winding mountain roads of Montana. 20 years had passed since he'd taken this route, yet every curve felt burned into his memory. The asphalt stretched ahead like a black ribbon through towering pines. Their shadows dancing across his weathered face, he downshifted as the grade steepened, the familiar weight of his father's keys jingling in his leather jacket pocket. Strange how he'd carried them all these years without thinking about it. The keys had been there the day he'd stolen the bike at 16, running from a home that felt like a prison of disappointment and broken promises. The wind whipped through his graying beard as he remembered that last fight with the old man. Words thrown like punches, accusations of abandonment and failure echoing through their cramped kitchen. His mother had been gone for months by then, vanished one morning without explanation, leaving only empty whiskey bottles and the lingering scent of her perfume. She ain't coming back. Boy, his father had slurred, bourbon heavy on his breath. Best you learn that now. Marcus had grabbed the Harley keys from the hook by the door, his young hands shaking with rage. Neither am I, he'd spit back and roared into the night on his father's prized motorcycle. The memory stung even now. Within a year, he'd found the Hells Angels, brothers who understood betrayal and abandonment. They'd welcomed him with leather and chrome, teaching him that family was something you chose, not something that chose you. The club had given him purpose, respect, and a name that meant something on the streets, but today, as he crested the final hill before the valley where his childhood home waited, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: uncertainty. The cabin came into view through a break in the trees exactly as he'd left it. The same weathered logs, the same sagging porch, the same sense of isolation that had once felt suffocating. Now it looked smaller somehow, diminished by time and abandonment. He pulled the Harley to a stop in the overgrown driveway, dust settling around him like ghosts. The silence was profound after hours of engine noise. No birds sang. No wind stirred the leaves. Even the mountains seemed to hold their breath. Marcus climbed off the bike, his legs stiff from the long ride. His boots crunched on gravel mixed with pine needles as he approached the front steps. The porch boards sagged under his weight, protesting with familiar groans. The front door hung slightly ajar, its green paint peeling like old skin. Marcus pushed it open with one finger, the hinges screaming in protest. The smell hit him immediately. Dust and decay, yes, but underneath something else. Something that reminded him of Sunday mornings and his mother's coffee. He stood in the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold. Part of him wanted to turn around, fire up the Harley, and disappear back into the life he'd built. The club was expecting him back next week. There were territories to defend, respect to maintain, brothers who depended on him. But something in that familiar smell drew him forward. One step, then another, until he stood in the living room where his family had once gathered. The furniture sat under white sheets like sleeping spirits. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming through dirty windows. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out the keys, examining them properly for the first time in years. They were old, brass worn smooth by countless hands. One was clearly for the Harley, but the others, a house key, something smaller, maybe for a lockbox or drawer. He'd never questioned why his father kept so many keys on one ring, never wondered what secrets they might unlock. Now standing in this tomb of memory, Marcus began to understand that perhaps he'd been carrying the answers all along. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved deeper into the house, each step an act of courage. Whatever waited for him here, whatever truth lay buried in this place, he was finally ready to face it. Behind him, the front door swung shut with a soft click, sealing him inside with 20 years of questions and the growing certainty that nothing would ever be the same. Marcus moved through the cabin like a man walking through his own grave. Each room held fragments of a life he'd tried to forget. The kitchen still smelled faintly of his mother's biscuits, though the cast-iron skillet sat cold and rusted on the stove. Her apron hung on its familiar hook, fabric faded, but somehow still holding the shape of her body. In the hallway, family photographs lined the walls in crooked frames. Marcus stopped before one showing his parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful. His father looked strong then, shoulders straight, eyes clear. His mother's smile was radiant, her hands clasped around a bouquet of wildflowers. They looked like people who believed in forever. The master bedroom door stood partially open. Marcus pushed it wider, revealing his parents' bed, still covered with the same blue quilt his grandmother had sewn. Dust particles swirled in the dim light, filtering through curtains that hadn't been opened in 20 years. On the nightstand, his father's reading glasses sat beside an empty beer bottle, as if he'd just set them down for the night. Marcus backed out of the room, unable to face whatever memories lurked in that space. Instead, he climbed the narrow stairs to what had been his childhood bedroom. The steps creaked in the same pattern he remembered from sneaking out as a teenager. His old room was smaller than he remembered, the slanted ceiling making it feel like a cave. His single bed remained unmade, sheets yellowed with age. Posters of motorcycles and rock bands peeled from the walls. But what stopped him cold was the drawing table by the window. A child's crayon drawing lay there, corners curled with time. Marcus approached it slowly, recognizing his own clumsy artwork from when he was perhaps 8 years old. The drawing showed 4 stick figures standing in front of a house. A man, a woman, a small boy, and what looked like a dog. Above them, a smiling sun watched over the happy family. "We were happy once," he whispered, running his finger along the waxy crayon lines. The drawing was signed in his childish scrawl. Marcus Sullivan, age 8, best family ever. The innocence of it cut deep. That little boy had believed in his family's permanence, had seen love where the grown man now saw only abandonment and broken promises. Marcus folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket next to his father's keys. Some things were too precious to leave behind. Downstairs again, he found himself drawn to his father's study. The small room had always been off-limits, a sanctuary where the old man would disappear with his bottles and his silence. Marcus had imagined terrible things happened behind that closed door. Now he turned the handle and stepped inside. Books lined every wall, volumes on mechanics, military history, and surprisingly, poetry. A wooden desk dominated the center, its surface covered with papers held down by a chunk of Montana granite. Marcus recognized his father's careful handwriting on scattered notes and letters, but it was the loose floorboard that caught his attention. One plank near the window didn't align properly with the others. Marcus knelt and pressed his fingers against it, feeling it shift. The wood was loose, as if it had been pried up repeatedly. His heart hammered as he worked his fingertips under the board's edge. It came up easily, revealing a hidden space beneath. Inside lay a metal strongbox, its green paint chipped with age. Marcus lifted it out, surprised by its weight. The box had a simple lock, the kind that required a small key. Marcus pulled out his father's keyring, examining the smaller keys he'd never understood. The third one fit perfectly. Inside the box, manila envelopes lay stacked like buried treasure. Each was labeled in his father's meticulous script. For Marcus, letters from Sarah, the truth about everything. His hands trembled as he lifted the first envelope, feeling the weight of 20 years of secrets. The silence in the cabin pressed around him like held breath. Outside, shadows were growing longer as afternoon aged toward evening. Marcus sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, the strong box open before him like Pandora's container. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his reasons for leaving lay in these envelopes. Whatever truth his father had hidden here would either destroy him or set him free. With shaking fingers, Marcus opened the first envelope and began to read. The first letter was dated 3 months after Marcus had fled home. His father's handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if each word carried enormous weight. Marcus, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you finally come home. I pray that day comes, son. I pray you find these letters and understand what really happened to us. Marcus's throat tightened. He continued reading, the paper rustling in his trembling hands. Your mother didn't leave us. Sarah didn't abandon you like I let you believe. She's been at Pine Ridge Psychiatric Hospital since 2 weeks before you left home. The doctors say her mind broke after her brother died in that car accident. She keeps asking for you, keeps writing you letters that I was too much of a coward to give you. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His mother had been sick, not selfish. Institutionalized, not indifferent. He set the letter aside and reached for the envelope marked Letters from Sarah. Inside were dozens of pages covered in his mother's familiar handwriting. Though the script grew increasingly erratic as the dates progressed, the first was heartbreaking in its normalcy. My sweet Marcus, I hope you're eating enough. The nurses here say I'll be home soon, that the medicine will help me think clearly again. I dream about your laugh, about making your favorite pancakes on Sunday mornings. Your father says you're angry with me for being sick, but I know you understand. You've always been my gentle boy. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He'd never been gentle. The Hell's Angels had beaten that softness out of him years ago, replacing it with steel and leather and the kind of hardness that kept a man alive on the streets. The letters continued, chronicling his mother's deteriorating mental state. Sometimes she wrote coherently about missing him. Other times, the pages contained rambling streams of consciousness, fragments of memories mixed with fantasy. But through it all, her love for him blazed like a constant flame. One letter made him sob aloud. Marcus, your father brought me a plastic hospital bracelet with his mother's name on it today. The nurses tell me my name is Sarah, but sometimes I forget. Sometimes I think I'm still 16 and waiting for Jimmy to pick me up for the prom. But when I hold this bracelet, I remember. I remember being your mama. I remember loving you so much it hurt. At the bottom of the envelope, Marcus found the bracelet she'd written about. Thin plastic, yellowed with age, bearing his mother's name and the dates of her final hospitalization. She'd worn it for 3 years before her heart gave out. Still asking for her son, who never came to visit, Marcus pressed the bracelet to his forehead, finally understanding the weight of his father's burden. The old man had been fighting 2 battles, caring for a wife who no longer recognized him most days, and trying to raise an angry teenager who blamed him for everything wrong in their world. He reached for another letter from his father, this one dated just 6 months before the old man's death. Son, I know you think I drove you away with my drinking and my anger. Truth is, I was drowning. Your mama needed round-the-clock care, and the insurance barely covered half. I took extra shifts at the mill, sold everything we owned, even considered selling the cabin. But this place has been in our family for 4 generations. I couldn't let go of it. Couldn't let go of the hope that someday you'd come home and understand. The drinking started as a way to sleep. After 18-hour days and long nights worrying about Sarah, bourbon was the only thing that quieted my mind. I became the kind of man I'd always despised. But I never stopped loving you, Marcus. Never stopped hoping you'd forgive an old fool who did everything wrong while trying to hold his family together. Marcus set the letter down and stared at the hospital bracelet in his palm. All those years, he'd carried his rage like a badge of honor. The abandoned son, the unwanted child, the boy whose parents chose liquor and madness over love. But the truth was so much more complicated, so much more painful. His parents had been heroes, fighting an impossible war against mental illness and financial ruin. They'd lost everything except their love for him, and he'd been too proud and too young to see it. Outside, darkness was falling over the mountains. Marcus sat alone in his father's study, surrounded by 20 years of hidden truth, finally understanding that he'd been wrong about everything. Marcus reached for the final envelope with shaking hands. This one was thicker than the others, marked simply the truth about everything in his father's steady script. Inside, he found documents that painted a picture of a man he'd never truly known. The first was a military discharge paper. His father had served 3 tours in Vietnam, earning a Purple Heart for wounds sustained during the Tet Offensive. Marcus pulled the medal from the envelope. Its ribbon faded, but the bronze heart still gleaming. He'd never known his father was a war hero. The old man had never spoken of Vietnam, never mentioned his service. Beneath the medal lay a psychiatric evaluation dated 1971. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. Recommend continued therapy and medication management. Patient reports nightmares, hypervigilance, and difficulty maintaining emotional connections with family members. Marcus's hands trembled as he read further. His father had fought battles on 2 fronts, overseas and in his own mind. The drinking hadn't been weakness. It had been a desperate attempt to quiet the ghosts that haunted him every night. A letter from the Veterans Administration explained the inadequacy of mental health support for returning soldiers. His father had been given pills that barely helped, and therapy sessions that lasted 15 minutes. He'd been left to fight his demons alone, the same way he'd later fight to save his wife's sanity and hold his family together. Another document made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. A job application from the lumber mill, dated 3 weeks after Marcus had fled home. In the section asking about family, his father had written, "One son, Marcus, good boy who deserves better than what I can give him. He's angry now, but he'll understand someday that everything I do is for him." Even after Marcus had stolen his bike and disappeared into the night, the old man still believed in him, still loved him enough to hope for understanding. The next letter was addressed to Marcus directly, written in the shaky handwriting of his father's final months. "Son, if you're reading this, then I'm with your mama again, and you've finally found the courage to come home. I hope these letters help you understand why I could never tell you the truth while I was alive. How do you explain to a 16-year-old boy that his father sees dead soldiers in the shadows? How do you tell your son that some nights you drink yourself unconscious just to stop the screaming in your head? I failed you, Marcus, not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you too much to burden you with my brokenness. Your mama and I, we both fought wars we couldn't win. Hers was against a mind that betrayed her. Mine was against memories that wouldn't die. But you, son, you were always our victory. Every day you smiled, every time you laughed, every moment you were happy. That was us winning against the darkness. You were the light in our broken world, and I'm sorry I was too proud to let you see how much you meant to us." Marcus pressed the Purple Heart against his chest, feeling the weight of his father's sacrifice. The man had carried Vietnam in his bones, had wrestled with trauma while working double shifts to pay for his wife's medical care. He'd watched the woman he loved slip away into madness while battling his own psychological wounds. The final document in the envelope was a deed to the cabin, signed over to Marcus with a note. "This land has been home to Sullivan men for 4 generations. It's yours now, along with the responsibility to do better than I did. Build something good here, son. Build the family we should have been." Marcus understood now why his father had never come after him, never tried to bring him home. The old man had believed his son deserved a chance at happiness, even if it meant living with the pain of separation. He'd sacrificed his own need for reconciliation to give Marcus the freedom to choose his own path. The Purple Heart felt warm in Marcus's palm, a tangible connection to the father he'd misjudged so completely. Outside, night sounds filtered through the cabin walls. Owls called to each other across the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its lonely song. Marcus sat in the study until dawn, reading and rereading his parents' words, finally understanding the depth of their love and the magnitude of his mistake. He'd spent 20 years running from people who'd given everything to protect him, building a life based on a lie he'd told himself about being unwanted. The truth was almost too heavy to bear, but it was his now, along with the cabin and the chance to honor his parents' memory by finally coming home. Dawn. Light filtered through the dusty windows as Marcus discovered another envelope he'd missed. In his emotional exhaustion, this one was stuffed with photographs, some professional, others clearly taken with a family camera. He spread them across his father's desk like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed. The first photograph showed an elderly couple standing in front of a modest farmhouse. The woman had kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. The man wore overalls and a gentle smile that seemed familiar. On the back, someone had written in careful script, "Robert and Eleanor Sullivan, 1985, still hoping to..." Hear from Marcus. Marcus stared at the faces, recognition dawning slowly. These were his father's parents, his own grandparents. He'd assumed they were dead, had never thought to ask about extended family during those turbulent teenage years. But here they were, looking directly into the camera with expressions of quiet longing. More photographs revealed a family tree he'd never known existed. Christmas gatherings with cousins opening presents around a massive tree. Birthday parties with children who shared his dark hair and stubborn chin. Wedding photos of aunts and uncles he'd never met, their faces beaming with joy. One photograph stopped him cold. A wedding picture of a couple he didn't recognize, but the bride wore his mother's wedding dress. The groom looked remarkably like his father in his younger days. On the back, James and Patricia Sullivan, 1990. Wish Marcus could have been here to meet his new aunt. His father had a brother. Marcus had an uncle he'd never known about. An aunt, and probably cousins who'd grown up knowing about him while he'd believed himself completely alone in the world. Another photo showed a group of children playing in what looked like the same farmhouse yard from the first picture. One boy, perhaps 10 years old, bore such a striking resemblance to Marcus at that age that it took his breath away. Written on the back, David Sullivan, age 10. Looks just like his cousin Marcus, don't you think? Cousins. He had cousins who looked like him, who carried the same Sullivan blood, who might have been friends if he'd ever bothered to learn they existed. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of Christmas cards spanning nearly 2 decades. Each one addressed to our missing grandson Marcus, with return addresses from various Sullivan family members. Some were sent to the cabin, others to post office boxes his father must have maintained. All were unopened, but carefully preserved. Inside the cards, handwritten messages spoke of love that persisted across time and distance. "We think of you every Christmas morning and pray you'll come home someday. Your grandfather still sets an extra place at Thanksgiving dinner, just in case. We have so many stories to tell you about your father when he was young." Marcus found a business card tucked between 2 photographs. Sullivan Family Insurance, James Sullivan, owner. There was a phone number with a local area code, an address in the next county over. His uncle had built a business here, had stayed close to home, while Marcus roamed the highways with strangers who called themselves brothers. The final photograph nearly broke him. It showed his grandparents holding a framed picture of Marcus from his high school yearbook. His grandmother's eyes were red from crying, his grandfather's arm protective around her shoulders. Someone had caught them in a moment of private grief, mourning a grandson they'd lost not to death but to pride and misunderstanding. On the back, his father's handwriting, "Mom and Dad on Marcus's 30th birthday. They still believe he'll come home," Marcus calculated quickly. That photo was taken 10 years ago. His grandparents had still been alive, still hoping, still setting extra places at family dinners. He'd been living 3 states away, earning his reputation as Iron Sullivan, building walls around his heart while blood relatives grieved his absence. The weight of all those missed years pressed down on him like a physical force. Birthday parties he should have attended, graduations he should have celebrated, funerals where he should have stood beside family members who'd never stopped loving him. He gathered the photographs into a careful stack, handling them like sacred relics. Somewhere out there, Sullivan family members were still living their lives, still carrying the hope that their missing piece might return. The question was whether they'd still welcome him after 20 years of silence, whether forgiveness could bridge such a vast canyon of time and hurt. Marcus reached for his father's old phone book, hands steady now with purpose. It was time to find out if family meant more than the mistakes that had driven them apart. Marcus stared at the yellowed phone number written in his father's careful handwriting. Robert Sullivan, Dad's number. The ink had faded but was still legible after all these years. He'd found it tucked inside his father's wallet, which had been sitting in the desk drawer like a time capsule. His grandfather's number. If the old man was still alive. Marcus's cell phone had no signal this deep in the mountains, so he made his way to the kitchen, where his father's ancient rotary phone still sat on the counter. The green plastic was cracked with age, but when he lifted the receiver, he heard the familiar dial tone. His hands shook as he dialed the number. Each digit clicked through the rotary mechanism with mechanical precision. Building toward a moment that could change everything or break his heart completely, the phone rang once, twice. Marcus almost hung up. Hello. The voice was elderly but strong, seasoned with the kind of authority that came from decades of making decisions and solving problems. Marcus's throat closed. He'd prepared no words for this moment, had no script for reaching across 20 years of silence. Hello? If this is one of those sales calls, I'm hanging up, grandfather. The word came out as a whisper, silence stretched across the connection. Marcus could hear the old man's breathing, could almost feel the shock traveling through the phone lines. Marcus? The voice broke on his name. Marcus, is that really you? It's me, Grandpa. I'm at the cabin. A sound escaped from the other end that might have been a sob or a prayer of thanksgiving. Oh, dear God, oh, my boy. We never stopped hoping, never stopped believing you'd come home. Marcus pressed his back against the kitchen wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor. I found the letters, the photographs. I know about Mom and Dad. I know about everything. Where have you been, son? 20 years without a word. Your grandmother went to her grave, believing she'd failed you somehow. The guilt hit like a physical blow. She's gone? 3 years now. Best in her sleep, still asking about you on her last day. His grandfather's voice carried decades of grief. She kept your room ready at the house, you know. Fresh sheets every week, just in case. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing the kind face from the photographs. His grandmother had died, still loving him, still hoping for a reunion that never came. I'm sorry, he whispered. I was so angry when I left. I thought they didn't want me, not want you. His grandfather's voice sharpened with indignation. Boy, you were the light of their lives. Your father called me every week asking if I'd heard anything. Your mother wrote you letters even when her mind was mostly gone, asking the nurses to mail them to an address nobody had. I joined a motorcycle club, became someone else, convinced myself I didn't need family. And now? Marcus looked around the kitchen, where his mother had made countless meals, where his father had sat drinking coffee and planning ways to provide for his broken family. Now I think I was wrong about everything. His grandfather's breathing was heavy with emotion. Are you staying? Or is this just a visit before you disappear again? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus thought about his Hell's Angels brothers waiting for his return, about the life he'd built on highways and in clubhouses. Then he thought about his parents dying alone, about missed Christmases and empty chairs at family dinners. I want to stay. I want to meet the family I should have known all along. We're not far. 30 miles north in Cedar Falls, there's a nursing home called Sunset Manor. His grandfather's voice gained strength. I'm in the assisted living section. Not because I can't take care of myself, mind you, but because your Uncle James insisted, after I had that little heart episode. Uncle James. I saw his picture. He looks like Dad, acts like him too. Stubborn as a Missouri mule. But he never gave up on you either. None of us did. Marcus pulled his father's wallet from his pocket, running his thumb over the worn leather. Inside, along with the phone number, he'd found his grandfather's address written on a scrap of paper, updated multiple times over the years as the old man moved from house to apartment to care facility. Can I come see you? Tomorrow, son, I'll be sitting by the window watching for you. And Marcus, bring pictures of your life. I want to know everything about the man you became, even if it wasn't the path we would have chosen for you. Marcus smiled for the first time in days. I'll be there, Grandpa. We love you, boy. Always have. Always will. Marcus's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up with the familiar name, Roadkill, his closest brother in the Hells Angels, the one man who'd stood by him through bar fights, police raids, and territorial wars with rival clubs. He almost didn't answer. The conversation with his grandfather still echoed in his ears, and the last thing he wanted was to be pulled back into the life he was beginning to question. But Roadkill would keep calling until he got an answer, and eventually he'd come looking. Iron, where the hell are you? Roadkill's gravelly voice carried concern and irritation in equal measure. Church was supposed to be 3 hours ago. Viper's asking questions, and you know how he gets when brothers go missing. Marcus looked down at his Hells Angels patch, the winged death's head that had been his identity for 2 decades. The leather was worn smooth from years of wear, the colors faded but still recognizable to any biker worth his salt. He'd earned this patch through blood and loyalty, had proven himself worthy of the Brotherhood through acts he preferred not to remember. I'm in Montana, he said finally. Had some family business to take care of. Family? Roadkill's laugh was harsh. Since when do you have family? You always said the club was your only family. Things change. Not for Hells Angels, they don't. Roadkill's tone shifted, became more serious. Look, brother, I don't know what's going on up there, but you need to get your ass back to California. We've got problems with the Mongols moving into our territory, and Vipers talking about making examples. Marcus knew what that meant. Violence, territory wars, the kind of brutal conflict that had defined his adult life but suddenly felt as distant as another man's memories. I need more time, he said. Time for what? Iron. You're starting to worry me. This isn't like you. You don't miss church. You don't disappear without telling your brothers where you're going. What's really happening up there? Marcus walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where he'd played as a child. How could? He explained to Roadkill that he'd discovered his entire life was built on a lie, that the abandonment and betrayal that had driven him to the club never actually happened. My parents are dead, he said. Have been for years. I just found out what really happened to them. Roadkill's silence stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. When his brother finally spoke, his voice was gentler. I'm sorry, man. I know that's got to be hard, even if you weren't close. But the dead stay dead, you know? You got a life here. You got brothers who depend on you. Do I, or do I just have a bunch of guys who'll replace me the minute I become inconvenient? That's club talk, Iron. Dangerous talk. You sound like you're thinking about walking away, and we both know what that means. Marcus did know. Hells Angels was a lifetime commitment. Brothers who tried to leave faced consequences that ranged from brutal beatings to worse. The patch on his back represented not just membership, but ownership. The club owned him, body and soul, until death. I'm not walking away, Marcus said, though the words felt false in his mouth. I just need to handle some things here first. How long? I don't know. That's not an answer Viper's going to accept. He's already asking why Iron Sullivan gets special treatment, why he gets to disappear when the club needs him most. Marcus touched his grandfather's phone number, still clutched in his free hand. Tomorrow he would sit with family who'd waited 20 years for his return. Tomorrow he would begin to understand what he'd really lost by choosing the patch over blood. "Tell Viper I'll be back soon," he lied. "You better be. And Iron, whatever you're thinking up there, remember who you are. Remember what you've built here. Don't throw away 20 years of Brotherhood for some ghost from your past." The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, then at his patch, feeling the weight of both. He'd built his identity around being unwanted, around being tough enough to survive without family, but that identity was crumbling like old leather, leaving him wondering who he really was underneath all the accumulated mythology. Outside, an eagle circled high above the trees, riding thermals with effortless grace. Marcus watched it soar, remembering when he used to dream of flying away from this place. Now he wondered if maybe the trick wasn't learning to fly, but learning to land. Sunset Manor sat on a gentle hillside overlooking Cedar Falls, its brick facade warm in the morning sunlight. Marcus parked his Harley in the visitor lot, conscious of how out of place the massive machine looked among the sedans and minivans. His leather jacket felt like armor as he walked through the automatic doors into a world that smelled of disinfectant and flowers. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, looked up with practiced smile that faltered slightly when she took in his appearance. The patches, the beard, the general aura of someone who'd lived hard and fast for too many years. "I'm here to see Robert Sullivan," Marcus said, his voice softer than usual. "Oh my!" Her eyes widened with recognition. "You must be Marcus. Mr. Sullivan has been sitting by his window since dawn, watching for you." She led him down a hallway lined with photographs of residents at various activities. Marcus glimpsed faces full of dignity and hard-earned wisdom, people who'd lived full lives and now faced their final chapters with grace he wasn't sure he possessed. His grandfather's room was at the end of the hall, door standing open. The old man sat in a wheelchair by the window, exactly as promised, but Marcus wasn't prepared for how small he looked. In the photographs, Robert Sullivan had seemed substantial, commanding. Now he appeared diminished by age and illness, though his eyes remained sharp and alert. "Grandfather?" Marcus stepped into the doorway, suddenly uncertain. The old man's face transformed with joy so pure, it took Marcus's breath away. "My boy, oh my sweet boy, come here." Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside the wheelchair. His grandfather's hands, spotted with age but still strong, cupped his face with infinite tenderness. "Let me look at you," Robert whispered. 20 years I've wondered what kind of man you'd become. I'm sorry I stayed away so long. Hush, you're here now. That's what matters." His grandfather's thumb traced a scar along Marcus's jawline. "You've lived hard." "I have." "Good. Soft men don't survive in this world, but hard men sometimes forget how to love. Have you forgotten, Marcus?" The question cut deep. Marcus thought about the walls he'd built, the emotional distance he'd maintained even with his closest brothers in the club. "I think maybe I have." "Then we'll have to remind you." Robert reached into his nightstand drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. "This belonged to your father. He wanted you to have it." Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, was another purple heart. The metal gleamed as if it had been polished recently, the ribbon crisp and new. "But I found Dad's purple heart at the cabin." That was his first one. This one he earned 6 months later when he went back into combat to pull 3 wounded soldiers to safety. "The army doesn't give out many second purple hearts, son. Your father was a genuine hero." Marcus lifted the medal, feeling its weight. His father had been wounded twice, had faced death multiple times, yet had never spoken of his courage. Instead, he'd carried his trauma in silence, never wanting to burden his family with the cost of his heroism. "He was proud of you," his grandfather continued. "Even after you left, he'd call me and talk for hours about the little boy who used to help him in his workshop, who asked endless questions about how engines worked." "I remember that," Marcus smiled despite the tears threatening to fall. He was so patient with me. He saw himself in you. The curiosity, the stubborn streak, the loyalty once you decided someone was worth your devotion. He knew that whoever you became, wherever you went, you'd be good at it. I don't know if he'd be proud of what I became. A survivor? A man loyal to his chosen brothers? A man who came home when it mattered most? Robert's grip tightened on Marcus's hand. He'd be proud, son. We're all proud. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the valley below through the window. Marcus could see the town where his family had built their lives, where Uncle James ran his insurance business, where cousins and aunts and uncles continued the Sullivan legacy he'd abandoned. There's so much I don't know about the family, Marcus said finally. Then we'll teach you. James is coming for lunch today, and tomorrow is Sunday dinner at the old farmhouse. The whole family gathers every week, hoping this would be the Sunday you'd finally join us. Marcus fingered his father's second purple heart, understanding for the first time that courage came in many forms. Sometimes it meant charging into battle. Sometimes it meant coming home. The old farmhouse looked exactly like it had in the photographs. White clapboard siding weathered to a comfortable grey wraparound porch, sagging slightly under the weight of decades. Cars filled the gravel driveway, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from the backyard. Marcus sat on his Harley at the end of the lane, engine ticking as it cooled, gathering courage for what felt like the most important ride of his life. Uncle James appeared on the porch, a man in his 60s who shared his father's build and stubborn jaw. He raised his hand in greeting, no fear or judgment in his expression despite Marcus's intimidating appearance. Behind him, other faces peered curiously through screen doors and windows. Marcus killed the engine and walked toward the house, his boots crunching on gravel. James met him halfway, arms open for an embrace that Marcus wasn't sure he deserved. "Welcome home, nephew," James said simply, and pulled him into a hug that smelled of aftershave and honest work. The screen door burst open, and children tumbled out, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 16. They stopped short when they saw Marcus, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. A girl of about 10 stepped forward with the fearless confidence of youth. "Are you really our cousin Marcus, the one Grandpa Robert talks about all the time?" "I am." "Cool bike," said a teenage boy with the Sullivan dark hair and serious eyes. "Is it really a Harley?" 1995. Electra Glide. Built her myself. The ice broken. The children peppered him with questions about motorcycles and life on the road, while James led him toward the house. Women emerged from the kitchen, wiping, hands on aprons and smoothing hair, preparing to meet the family legend who'd finally come home. Aunt Patricia, James's wife from the wedding photograph, embraced him with tears in her eyes. "We've prayed for this day for 20 years, she whispered. More introductions followed. Cousins David and Sarah, both in their 30s now with children of their own. Great-aunt Helen, a spry woman of 80 who immediately began critiquing his thin frame and promising to remedy it with her cooking. Uncle Martin and Aunt Rose, who'd driven 3 hours just to meet him, but it was the family Bible that stopped Marcus cold. Patricia placed it in his hands with reverence, opening to pages yellowed with age. Handwritten entries chronicled births, deaths, marriages, and baptisms stretching back to the 1800s. Robert Sullivan, born March 15, 1923, she read aloud, pointing to his grandfather's entry. Thomas Robert Sullivan, born August 8, 1945, his father. And here, Marcus Thomas Sullivan, born June 22, 1975. His name was there recorded in his grandmother's careful script. Below it, a blank line where his marriage should be recorded, where his children's names should appear. The family had kept space for him, believing he would eventually return to fill those empty lines. "We never gave up," Patricia said softly. "Your grandmother insisted we keep your page current, said you'd want to see your place in the family when you came home." Marcus traced his finger along the faded ink of his birth record. Below the basic information, someone had added notes over the years. Graduated high school 1993. Joined motorcycle club 1995. Whereabouts unknown, but prayed for daily. They'd tracked his life from a distance, celebrating his achievements and mourning his absence. The family had maintained connection even when he'd severed it, love persisting across decades of silence. Dinner was chaos in the best possible way. 3 generations crowded around a table built to accommodate Sullivan family gatherings, passing dishes and stories with equal enthusiasm. Marcus found himself seated between his grandfather and young cousin Emma, who'd appointed herself his official welcomer homer. "Tell us about your adventures," demanded teenage David. "Grandpa says you've been everywhere." Marcus started carefully, editing his stories for mixed company. But as the evening wore on, he found himself sharing more than he'd intended. The beauty of cross-country rides at dawn, the brotherhood of men who'd chosen each other as family, the satisfaction of rebuilding engines with his own hands. He omitted the violence, the territory wars, the illegal activities that had funded their lifestyle. But the essence of his journey, the search for belonging and purpose, resonated with relatives who understood the Sullivan need for independence. As the evening wound down and families began gathering children and coats, Patricia pressed a wrapped package into his hands. "From your grandmother," she explained. "She wrapped it the Christmas after you left, said to give it to you when you came home." Inside was a hand-knitted sweater, soft blue wool worked in a pattern he didn't recognize. A note in his grandmother's writing said simply, "For my grandson Marcus, with all my love. I know you'll find your way home eventually." Marcus was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the rumble of motorcycles approaching. The sound was unmistakable, multiple Harleys ridden hard and fast. He set down his axe and walked to the front porch, unsurprised to see 5 Hell's Angels emerge from the tree line. Roadkill led the group, his weathered face grim beneath his helmet. Behind him rode Viper, the chapter president, whose cold eyes had witnessed more violence than most men could imagine. Tank Diesel and Crow completed the group, all brothers Marcus had bled with during territorial wars and club business. They parked in formation, engines ticking in the sudden silence. Marcus remained on the porch, noting how they positioned themselves like soldiers preparing for battle. This wasn't a social call. "Iron," Viper said, removing his helmet to reveal grey hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Interesting place you found here. Very domestic." Marcus descended the porch steps slowly, aware that every movement was being evaluated. "Viper wasn't expecting company, weren't you?" Viper's smile was cold. "You disappear for 2 weeks without permission. Miss 3 churches. Ignore orders to return. What did you expect?" Roadkill dismounted, his expression pained. "I tried to tell you, brother. Tried to warn you that Viper was losing patience. I needed time to handle family business." "Family business," Viper spat in the dirt. "Since when do Hell's Angels have family outside the club? Since when does Iron Sullivan, enforcer for the California chapter, play house in the mountains?" Tank stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. The man was built like his namesake, all muscle and barely controlled violence. Maybe Iron's gone soft? Maybe he's forgotten what it means to wear our colors. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded violence. These men had been his brothers, but they'd also been trained to view any deviation from club loyalty as betrayal. He'd participated in similar confrontations, had helped deliver punishment to brothers who'd stepped out of line. "I haven't forgotten anything," Marcus said carefully. Viper pulled a folded document from his jacket, the official club charter that governed every aspect of their lives. The rules were simple and absolute. The club came first, always. Brothers who tried to leave faced consequences ranging from brutal beatings to death. Family relationships and outside obligations were secondary to club loyalty. Article 7, Viper read aloud. "No member may maintain primary loyalty to any organization, family, or individual outside the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Violation of this oath is punishable by loss of colors and immediate expulsion. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Loss of colors meant more than just removing his patch. It meant becoming a target for every Hell's Angel in the country, marked as a traitor who could never be trusted. Article 12, Viper continued. Members who attempt to abandon the Brotherhood forfeit all protection and may be subject to permanent discipline. Permanent discipline. Marcus knew what that meant. He'd helped deliver it to others who'd tried to walk away. Crow, the youngest of the group, shifted nervously. Come on, Iron, just get your gear and ride back with us. This doesn't have to get ugly. Marcus looked at each man in turn, seeing decades of shared history reflected in their faces. These men had been his family when he'd believed he had no other. They'd stood with him in fights, had trusted him with their lives, had welcomed him into a brotherhood built on mutual loyalty and shared danger. But they were also killers. Drug dealers. Men who'd chosen to live outside society's rules and expected absolute conformity to their own. The patch on his back represented not just membership, but ownership of his soul. I found letters, Marcus said finally. My parents didn't abandon me. They were sick, struggling, trying to protect me from things I was too young to understand. So what? Viper's voice carried no sympathy. The past is dead. What matters is what you choose now. Roadkill stepped closer, his voice urgent. Marcus, whatever you think you found here, it's not worth dying for. These people don't know you like we do. They don't know what you've done, what you're capable of. Maybe that's the point, Marcus said quietly. The admission hung between them like a challenge. Viper's hand moved to his jacket, where Marcus knew he carried a pistol. The other brothers tensed, reading the signals that preceded violence. You have 24 hours to decide, Viper said finally. Ride back with us tomorrow, or face the consequences of betraying your oath. Choose wisely, Iron. Choose permanently. Marcus sat alone in his father's study as midnight approached, the club's ultimatum weighing on him like a stone. The Hell's Angels had made camp in the valley below, their fires visible through the trees. They would wait until dawn, then expect his answer. He'd found his father's journal in the desk drawer, its leather cover worn smooth by countless readings. The final entries were dated just weeks before the old man's death, written in handwriting that grew increasingly shaky as illness took hold. March 15th. Saw Dr. Patterson today. Says I have maybe 3 months if I'm lucky. Haven't told James yet. Don't want him hovering like a mother hen. Main thing is getting these letters organized for Marcus. If there's any justice in this world, my boy will come home before I'm in the ground. If not, at least he'll know the truth eventually. Marcus turned the page, his throat tight. March 22nd. Found myself thinking about Marcus as a little boy today. He used to help me in the workshop, always asking how things worked. Patient as Job when I tried to teach him to use tools. Smart boy, smarter than his old man. Hope he's found something worth building with those hands of his. The entries continued, chronicling a dying man's reflections on fatherhood and regret. But it was the final entry that broke Marcus completely. April 3rd. Don't think I'll see another week. Pain's getting bad, but I keep thinking about Marcus. Wonder if he's happy wherever he is. Wonder if he's found people who love him the way we did. Sarah used to say that love doesn't disappear just because someone goes away. She said love waits, like seeds under snow, ready to grow again when spring comes. I hope Marcus finds his spring. I hope he learns that a man's not defined by his mistakes, but by his willingness to come home when it matters. The cabin will be here. For him, the family will be here. Love will be here, waiting for him to claim it. If you're reading this, son, then you've finally come home. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't let pride keep you from the people who matter. Don't let fear convince you that you're not worthy of love. You are. You always have been. You always will be. Build something good with your life, Marcus. Build the family we should have been. Marcus closed the journal and walked to the window, looking down at the Hell's Angels camp. Those men represented 20 years of chosen family, brotherhood forged in violence and sealed with blood. They'd given him purpose when he'd believed himself worthless, had provided belonging when he'd felt completely alone. But they'd also trapped him in a life built on anger and revenge. Every day with the club had been about taking rather than building, destroying rather than creating. He'd become expert at breaking things, including himself. He thought about his grandfather's joy at seeing him again, about cousins who'd welcomed him despite 2 decades of absence. He thought about his father's workshop tools, still hanging on their hooks, waiting for hands that knew how to build instead of destroy. The choice should have been impossible. The Hells Angels owned him, had invested 20 years in making him one of them. Leaving meant facing their wrath, possibly dying for the crime of choosing blood over brotherhood. But as Marcus sat in his father's chair, surrounded by evidence of love that had persisted through every disappointment, he understood something that had eluded him for decades. Real family didn't demand ownership of your soul. Real love didn't threaten violence when you needed to grow. His parents had let him go because they'd believed it was best for him, even though it broke their hearts. His grandparents had waited decades without demanding his return. His extended family had welcomed him with open arms, asking nothing except that he stay if he wanted to. The Hells Angels demanded absolute loyalty, threatened death for the crime of choosing differently. The comparison was stark and painful. Marcus opened his father's journal to the last entry and read it again, focusing on the final lines. Build something good with your life, Marcus. Build the family we should have been. Outside, an owl called across the darkness, its voice lonely but strong. Marcus understood that loneliness now, the ache of choosing the harder path. But he also understood that some choices once made defined the rest of a man's life. He would honor his father's dying wish. He would build something good, something worthy of the love that had waited for him through 2 decades of winter. And if the Hells Angels wanted to kill him for that choice, at least he'd die trying to become the man his parents had always believed he could be. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains as Marcus walked down to the Hells Angels camp. He carried his colors in a canvas bag, the patches carefully removed from his leather jacket the night before. 20 years of identity reduced to pieces of cloth and thread, yet he felt lighter with each step. The brothers were already awake, sitting around their dying campfire like warriors preparing for battle. Viper looked up as Marcus approached, his eyes immediately noting the missing patches on the leather jacket. "Well, well," Viper said, standing slowly. "Looks like Iron Sullivan has made his choice." Marcus stopped 10 feet from the group, close enough to talk, but far enough to react if things turned violent. "I'm done, Viper, I'm out." Tank lurched to his feet, fists clenched. "You ungrateful piece of garbage. We made you. We gave you everything. You gave me a place to hide," Marcus corrected. "I'm grateful for that. But I don't need to hide anymore." Roadkill remained seated, his face a mask of disappointment and betrayal. 20 years, Marcus. 20 years of brotherhood, and you're throwing it away for people who don't even know who you really are. "They know who I want to become." Crow spat into the fire, making it hiss. "They won't want you when they find out what you've done. When they learn about Phoenix. About the Mongol who won't ever ride again because of your bare hands." The reminder hit like a physical blow. Marcus had killed for the club, had committed acts of violence that would horrify his newfound family. But that was exactly why he needed to leave, why he needed to become someone better than the man he'd been. Viper reached into his jacket and pulled out the club charter document, the same one he'd read from yesterday. But this time he opened it to a different section, pointing to specific clauses with his finger. Article 15, he read aloud. "Any member who founded or helped establish a chapter maintains special obligations to the Brotherhood. Founding members may not resign without unanimous consent of all chapter officers." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd helped establish the California chapter, had been one of the original 5 members who'd built it from nothing. That meant different rules, deeper obligations, more severe consequences for betrayal. Article 16, Viper continued. Founding members who attempt to abandon their responsibilities forfeit all rights to mercy or consideration. Such betrayal is punishable by death. The words hung in the morning air like a death sentence. Marcus had known the risks, but seeing them spelled out in the Charter's unforgiving language made them brutally real. Diesel laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Looks like your new family's about to lose their long-lost son pretty quick. Unless," Viper said, closing the Charter and tucking it away, "Iron comes to his senses, gets back on his bike, rides home where he belongs." Marcus looked at each man in turn, seeing 20 years of shared history in their faces. These men had been his family when he'd believed himself alone in the world. They'd taught him to fight, to survive, to never show weakness or fear. But they'd also taught him that love was conditional, that belonging required surrendering your conscience to the group. They'd replaced his abandoned family with a brotherhood built on violence and mutual fear. "I helped build something with you," Marcus said finally. "But what we built was ugly. What we built hurt people. I want to build something different now." "With what?" Tank sneered. "You think you can just walk away from what you are? You think playing house with Grandpa and the cousins will wash the blood off your hands? I think trying is better than not trying." Viper pulled his gun, a .45 that had ended more than one conversation about club loyalty. "This is your last chance, Iron. Get on your bike and ride with us, or we settle this here and now." Marcus reached into his canvas bag and pulled out his colors, the patches he'd worn with pride for 2 decades. The Death's Head seemed to grin at him, mocking his attempt to change. "These belong to you now," he said, tossing the bag at Viper's feet. "I'm not Iron Sullivan anymore. I'm just Marcus trying to figure out how to be better than he was." Viper raised the gun, finger tightening on the trigger. "Then Marcus dies today," but Roadkill stood up, his hand closing over Viper's wrist. "Wait." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap as the 2 men stared at each other, decades of club hierarchy balanced against unexpected mercy. "What the hell are you doing?" Viper snarled at Roadkill, the gun still pointed at Marcus's chest. Roadkill kept his grip on Viper's wrist, his weathered face grim with determination. "What needs doing? Iron saved my life in Bakersfield. 3 Mongols had me down, and he waded in with nothing but a tire iron and pure rage. I owe him blood debt. Blood debt doesn't override club law," Tank growled, but he made no move to intervene. "Maybe not," Roadkill agreed. "But it means I get to call how this plays out." Viper's finger remained on the trigger, his eyes cold as winter. "You're making a mistake, old man. Letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Am I?" Roadkill looked at Marcus, then back at Viper. "Or am I remembering what Brotherhood really means? We built this chapter together, all of us. That means something." Marcus watched the standoff, understanding that his life hung in the balance of loyalties older than club rules. Roadkill was risking everything for him, potentially signing his own death warrant by defying a direct order from the chapter president. Crow shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "Roadkill, don't do this. Don't throw away 30 years for a traitor." "He's not a traitor," Roadkill said quietly. "He's a man trying to find his way home. Sometimes that takes more courage than staying with what's comfortable." Viper's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Philosophy from a killer. That's rich." But the gun lowered slightly, and Marcus saw uncertainty creep into the president's eyes. Roadkill commanded respect among the brothers, had earned his place through decades of loyalty and violence. His defiance carried weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his cut, the leather vest that had been his uniform and identity for 20 years. All the patches were gone now, removed carefully with a seam ripper in the pre-dawn darkness. What remained was just leather, worn soft by countless miles and scarred by old battles. "This is all I have left of Iron Sullivan," Marcus said, holding up the empty vest. "Everything else belongs to a life I'm walking away from." He dropped the cut at Viper's feet, the leather landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo across the mountain valley. The gesture was final, irreversible, cutting his last connection to the brotherhood that had defined him for 2 decades. Diesel stared at the discarded vest. His expression conflicted. You're making a mistake, Iron. World out there doesn't forgive what we've done. Doesn't matter how hard you try to change. Maybe not, Marcus agreed. But I have to try. My father died believing I could be better than what I became. I owe it to him to find out if he was right. Viper holstered his gun with deliberate slowness, his face a mask of cold rage. Fine, Roadkill wants to play protector, that's his choice. But here's what happens next, Iron. You're out, dead to us. You see any of our colors on the road, you better pray we're feeling charitable that day. I understand. Do you? Viper kicked the discarded cut, sending it sliding across the dirt. You understand that there's no going back? No changing your mind when things get tough with your precious family? You walk away now. You're walking away forever. Marcus looked at each man one final time, memorizing faces that had been constants in his life for 20 years. These men had been his brothers, his family, his identity. Leaving them felt like cutting off a limb, but it also felt like learning to breathe again. Forever, he agreed. Roadkill released Viper's wrist and stepped toward Marcus. For a moment, the two men faced each other, decades of shared history passing between them in silence. You sure about this? Roadkill asked quietly. I'm sure. Then ride safe, brother. And if you ever need anything at all, you call me. Club rules be damned. They embraced briefly, the gesture hidden from the other brothers by Roadkill's broad back. Marcus felt the older man slip something into his jacket pocket, but didn't look to see what it was. The Hell's Angels mounted their bikes without ceremony, engines roaring to life in the morning stillness. Viper led them away without looking back, but Marcus caught Roadkill's nod of farewell before the group disappeared into the trees. Alone on the mountainside, Marcus pulled Roadkill's gift from his pocket. It was a business card for a motorcycle repair shop in Billings, with a phone number written on the back in Roadkill's careful script. A lifeline offered by the one brother who'd understood that sometimes love meant letting go. Marcus found his grandfather sitting on the cabin's front porch the next morning, a thermos of coffee steaming in the cool mountain air. The old man had somehow made his way up from the nursing home. Probably talked Uncle James into driving him despite the early hour. Figured you might need some company today, Robert said, patting the empty chair beside him. Marcus settled onto the porch, accepting the offered cup of coffee with hands that still trembled slightly from the morning's confrontation. How did you know? Heard the motorcycles leaving at dawn. Saw the smoke from their camp disappearing down the valley. His grandfather's eyes were sharp, despite his age. Man doesn't make a choice like that without feeling it in his bones. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks. Marcus had expected to feel regret or fear after cutting ties with the Hell's Angels. But instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Your father left something else for you, Robert said eventually, reaching into a worn canvas bag at his feet. Been saving it for when you were ready. He pulled out a wooden toolbox, its surface scarred by decades of honest use. The brass nameplate read T.R. Sullivan in simple block letters. Marcus recognized it immediately. His father had carried this box to every job, had used these tools to build and repair and create. He always said a man's tools were the measure of his character. Robert continued. Used to talk about teaching you carpentry, about passing down the skills his own father had taught him. Marcus opened the box with reverent care. Inside, hand tools lay nestled in custom-fitted compartments. Chisels, planes, measuring squares, and mallets, all maintained in perfect condition despite their age. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a hand-carved wooden plane that looked much older than the others. That one belonged to your great-grandfather, Robert explained. Made it himself in 1923, used it to build half the barns in this county. 4 generations of Sullivan men have worked with that plane. Marcus lifted the antique tool, feeling its weight and balance. The wood was polished smooth by countless hands, shaped by years of honest labor. This was legacy in physical form, proof that his family had always been builders rather than destroyers. I don't know the first thing about carpentry, Marcus admitted. Then it's time you learned. James has been wanting to renovate the old barn behind the house, turn it into a workshop. Could use a strong back and willing hands. Over the following days, Marcus discovered muscles he'd forgotten he had. Working alongside Uncle James and Cousin David, he learned to measure twice and cut once, to respect the grain of the wood, to take satisfaction in work that created rather than destroyed. His hands, scarred from decades of violence, proved surprisingly gentle with delicate joinery. The same fingers that had once inflicted pain now coaxed beauty from rough lumber, turning chaos into order through patience and skill. "You've got the touch," James observed, as Marcus fitted a perfect mortise and tenon joint. "Your father would be proud." The work was meditation, each stroke of the plane stripping away layers of accumulated anger and resentment. Marcus found himself thinking less about the life he'd left behind and more about the future he might build. The cabin needed repairs, updates, love. He could provide all three. His grandfather visited daily, sometimes helping with simple tasks, but mostly just talking. Stories about family history, about the land they'd worked for generations, about the dreams his parents had harbored for their only son. "Your grandmother always said this place needed children's laughter again," Robert mentioned one afternoon as they watched Cousin Emma chase fireflies in the early evening light. Said it was too quiet without young voices. Marcus thought about that as he worked on the cabin's sagging porch, replacing rotten boards with new lumber milled from trees on the family land. The idea of children seemed foreign after 20 years of brotherhood without families, but not impossible. Not anymore. The work progressed slowly but steadily. Window frames straightened. Floorboards stopped creaking. The kitchen sink finally drained properly for the first time in decades. Each repair was a small victory, proof that Marcus Sullivan could build things that lasted. Late at night, sitting in his father's restored chair with a cup of coffee, and the day's satisfying ache in his muscles, Marcus would run his thumb along the smooth handle of his great-grandfather's plane. 4 generations of Sullivan men had found purpose in honest work, in creating something worthwhile with their hands. Now it was his turn to carry on that tradition, to build the family and home his parents had always dreamed of. The cabin's kitchen smelled like heaven for the first time in decades. Marcus stood at the stove, following his mother's handwritten recipe for beef stew, his hands surprisingly steady as he measured spices and stirred the bubbling pot. The recipe box had been tucked away in a cabinet, its wooden surface worn smooth by his mother's touch. "Add a pinch more salt, sweetheart," he could almost hear her voice saying. "And don't forget the bay leaves. They make all the difference." Each recipe card was a love letter from the past. Chicken and dumplings for Sunday dinners, apple pie for birthdays, chocolate chip cookies for after-school snacks. His mother's careful notations filled the margins. Marcus's favorite, or makes enough for leftovers, or remember to let the dough rest. The family would arrive soon for the first dinner Marcus had ever hosted in his childhood home. Uncle James was bringing fresh bread from the bakery in town, and Patricia was making her famous green bean casserole. The children were excited to see the cabin's renovations, to eat in the same kitchen where their grandfather had grown up. Marcus had spent the morning setting the dining room table with his mother's good china, plates that hadn't seen use since her final Christmas. The tablecloth was yellowed with age but still beautiful, embroidered with wildflowers that matched the bouquet his mother had carried on her wedding day. A soft knock at the door interrupted his cooking. Marcus opened it to find his grandfather standing on the porch, leaning heavily on his walker, but smiling with quiet pride. "Smells like your mother's kitchen used to," Robert said, making his way inside. "She'd be so happy to see you cooking her recipes." "I'm nervous," Marcus admitted. "What if I mess it up? What if it doesn't taste right?" "Food tastes better when it's made with love," his grandfather assured him. "Your mother always said that. And son, this whole place is filled with love now. Can feel it in the walls." It was true. The cabin had transformed over the past month from a tomb of memories into a living, breathing home. Fresh paint brightened the walls. New curtains let in light that had been blocked for 20 years. The floors gleamed with fresh varnish, no longer creaking with each step, but the most important change was invisible. The weight of sadness that had pressed down on the place was lifting, replaced by something Marcus was still learning to recognize. Hope. Car doors slammed in the driveway, followed by the sound of children's voices raised in excitement. Through the window, Marcus watched his extended family emerge from their vehicles, arms full of covered dishes and genuine smiles. Cousin Emma bounded up the porch steps first, her face bright with curiosity. "Uncle Marcus, did you really cook dinner all by yourself?" "I had help," he said, indicating his mother's recipe box. "Your great-grandmother left me instructions." The family filled the cabin with warmth and laughter, exclaiming over the renovations and praising Marcus's cooking efforts. Uncle James carved the roast with ceremony, while Aunt Patricia arranged side dishes on serving platters. The children set napkins and filled water glasses, treating the dinner like the celebration it had become. As they gathered around the table, Marcus felt a moment of panic. He'd never said grace, never led a family prayer. The Hell's Angels had scorned religion as weakness, had mocked the very idea of gratitude or humility. But his grandfather reached for his hand, and Aunt Patricia took the other, and suddenly the entire family was connected in a circle of clasped hands and bowed heads. "Lord," Robert began, his voice steady, with decades of faith, "we thank you for bringing our boy home. We thank you for this food prepared with love, for this house filled with family, for second chances and new beginnings. We ask your blessing on Marcus as he starts this new chapter of his life. Amen. Amen." The family echoed, and Marcus found himself saying the word too, meaning it in ways he'd never expected. The meal passed in a blur of conversation and shared stories. Cousin David asked about motorcycle engines, genuinely interested in Marcus's mechanical knowledge. Aunt Patricia shared memories of his mother's cooking, promising to teach him more family recipes. Uncle James discussed plans for expanding the workshop, including Marcus in future projects, as if his presence was permanent and welcome. As the evening wound down and dishes were cleared, Marcus pulled his mother's recipe box close to his chest. These cards represented more than instructions for cooking. They were blueprints for creating a home, for nurturing family, for expressing love through simple daily acts of care. Tomorrow, he would try the chocolate chip cookie recipe. Next week, maybe the apple pie. Each dish would be a small act of connection to the mother he'd lost and the family he'd found again. The morning was crisp and clear when Marcus walked into the motorcycle dealership in Cedar Falls, his grandfather beside him in his wheelchair. The showroom gleamed with chrome and possibility, rows of new Harleys reflecting the autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows. "You sure about this?" Robert asked, watching Marcus examine a deep blue Electra Glide Classic. "That's a lot of money for a man starting over." Marcus ran his hand along the fuel tank, feeling the smooth paint and honest steel beneath. His father's stolen Harley sat in the cabin's garage, still running strong after all these years, but it carried too much history. Too many memories of angry flight and 20 years of running from the truth. "I need something that's mine," Marcus explained. "Something I chose instead of something I took." The salesman approached, a middle-aged man with grease under his fingernails and the easy confidence of someone who understood motorcycles. "Beautiful machine," he said, patting the Electra Glide's seat. "This one's got the 103 engine 6-speed transmission, built for long rides and reliability." "I'll take it," Marcus said without hesitation. "Don't you want to hear about financing options? Extended warranties?" Marcus pulled out an envelope thick with cash, payment for the construction work he'd been doing around the county. Word had spread quickly about Tom Sullivan's boy coming home, about his skill with tools and his willingness to work hard for fair wages. There was enough honest labor in these mountains to keep a man busy for years. "Cash sale," Marcus said simply. The paperwork took an hour, but the most important moment came when the salesman handed him the registration. For the first time in 20 years, a motorcycle would be titled in his real name. Marcus Thomas Sullivan, not Iron or any of the other names he'd worn like masks. Where to first? His grandfather asked, as Marcus wheeled the new bike out of the showroom. There's somewhere I need to go. Someone I need to take with me. They drove to Pine Ridge Cemetery in Uncle James's truck, the new Harley following on a trailer. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the valley, its headstones arranged in neat rows under towering pine trees. Marcus had avoided this place for 43 years, afraid of what he might feel standing over his parents' graves, but fear wasn't driving his decisions anymore. He found their headstones in the Sullivan family section, simple granite markers that spoke of lives lived with dignity despite their struggles. Thomas Robert Sullivan, 1945-2018, beloved husband and father. Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan, 1947-2015, forever in our hearts. Marcus knelt between the graves, placing his hands flat on the earth that covered his parents. The ground was soft from recent rain, rich with the promise of spring growth. Somewhere beneath the soil lay the people who'd given him life, who'd loved him despite his anger, who'd believed in his goodness even when he'd forgotten it himself. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. Sorry I believed the worst instead of looking for the truth. Sorry I wasted so many years being angry about things that weren't your fault." His grandfather's hand settled on his shoulder, offering comfort across the generations. "They know, son. They've always known." Marcus pulled the new motorcycle registration from his jacket pocket, holding it where his parents could see if such things were possible. "I bought this bike with honest money," he said. "Earned it building things instead of tearing them down. It's titled, 'In the Name You Gave Me,' the name I'm proud to carry now." The wind stirred the pine branches overhead, making a sound like whispered forgiveness. Marcus stood and helped his grandfather back to his feet, both men taking a moment to absorb the peace of this sacred place. "You know what your mother would say if she were here?" Robert asked. "What?" "She'd say it's about time you took your old grandpa for a ride on that fancy new motorcycle." Marcus laughed, the sound echoing across the cemetery like a promise. "You think you're up for it?" "Son, I've been waiting 80 years for someone to offer. Let's see what that Harley can do." They spent the afternoon cruising the mountain roads, grandfather and grandson, sharing the joy of wind and freedom and family connection. The new bike ran smooth as silk, carrying them through landscapes that spoke of home and belonging. When they finally returned to the cabin as sunset painted the mountains gold, Marcus understood that the circle was finally complete. He'd come home not as the angry boy who'd fled in darkness, but as a man ready to build the life his parents had always dreamed he would live. 1 year later, Marcus stood on the cabin's front porch, watching his family gather for Thanksgiving dinner. The November air was crisp with the promise of winter. But inside, the house glowed with warmth and the sound of multiple conversations overlapping in comfortable chaos. Cousin Emma hung from the porch railing, her legs swinging as she peppered him with questions about the motorcycle restoration project in his workshop. Uncle James emerged from the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and flour on his apron, carrying the turkey he'd insisted on cooking himself. Aunt Patricia directed traffic from the dining room, orchestrating the placement of side dishes with the precision of a general commanding troops. But it was the photograph in Marcus's hand that made this moment perfect. The family picture had been taken an hour earlier, all of them gathered on these same porch steps. His grandfather sat in the center, flanked by children and grandchildren, great-nieces and nephews, a living testament to the power of love to endure across generations. In the photo, Marcus stood behind his grandfather's chair, his hand resting on the old man's shoulder. The face looking back from the image was weathered but peaceful, marked by experience but no longer hardened by anger. This was Marcus Sullivan, not Iron. A man who belonged somewhere, who had people worth protecting and a future worth building. The front door opened behind him, and Roadkill stepped onto the porch. The sight of his former Hells Angels brother still surprised Marcus, though this was the third time Roadkill had made the long ride from California to visit. The old biker had kept his promise about staying in touch, had become living proof that some bonds transcended club loyalties. Hell of a spread in there, Roadkill said, nodding toward the dining room where the feast was taking shape. Your family knows how to do Thanksgiving right. They're good people, Marcus agreed. Better than I deserve, probably. Maybe, but that's what family does. Loves you anyway. Roadkill leaned against the porch railing, his own face showing the changes a year could bring. You look good, Marcus. Look like a man who's found his place. I have. What about you? You still riding with the club? Roadkill's smile was rueful. Some, but mostly I'm working at that bike shop I told you about. Turns out there's satisfaction in fixing things instead of breaking them. Who knew? Through the window, they could see the family moving around the kitchen and dining room, preparing for the meal with practiced efficiency. Marcus's grandfather directed operations from his wheelchair, offering advice and gentle criticism with the authority of a man who'd presided over decades of family gatherings. He's proud of you, Roadkill observed, following Marcus's gaze. Can see it in the way he looks at you. I'm proud of him too, of all of them. They never gave up on me, even when I'd given up on myself. A motorcycle rumbled in the distance, and both men tensed, instinctively before relaxing. Old habits died hard, but this was just someone passing through, not a threat from their shared past. You ever miss it? Roadkill asked. The life we had? The Brotherhood? Marcus considered the question, watching his young cousin David tinker with a model airplane at the far end of the porch. I miss parts of it, the sense of purpose, the loyalty, but I don't miss the anger. Don't miss always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the next fight. Yeah, gets tired after a while. Uncle James appeared in the doorway, grinning at both men. Dinner's ready. And Marcus, your grandfather wants you to say grace. The responsibility still felt strange, but Marcus nodded. A year of family dinners had taught him that grace wasn't about perfect words or theological knowledge. It was about gratitude, about recognizing the gifts that life offered to those humble enough to accept them. The dining room filled with family, 3 generations crowding around the table Marcus had rebuilt with his own hands. As they joined hands for prayer, Marcus felt the familiar weight of connection, the knowledge that he belonged to something larger than himself. Lord, he began, his voice steady with hard-won faith, we thank you for this food for this family, for second chances and the courage to take them. We're grateful for the love that waits for us even when we don't deserve it, and for the grace that brings us home. Amen. Amen, the family echoed, and the feast began. Later, as the evening wound down and relatives began the process of loading leftovers into containers, Marcus slipped the family photograph into his wallet. Tomorrow it would sit on his workshop bench, a reminder of what mattered most. A reminder that he'd finally learned the difference between running away and coming home.